Hello everyone, welcome back once again to this educational channel called Learn Bio with Janet. I'm teacher Janet and today we'll be discussing a Form 5 biology topic from the Kssm syllabus, which is the new syllabus. We'll be discussing chapter 4, subtopic 4.2 on the transport of water and mineral salts in plants. There will be a HOTS question at the end and also a memory aid to help you remember some of the things that you have studied. So let's get started. The learning standards or learning outcomes for today's lesson are as follows. For learning standard 4.2.1, after this lesson, you should be able to describe the factors involved in the pathway of water and mineral salts from soil to shoots. There are three factors involved in the pathway of water and mineral salts from soil to shoots, and these are root pressure, capillary action, and transpirational pull. So we'll be learning about these three forces. So before we begin, here is a good schematic diagram to give you a basic outline of what we're going to discuss, and also it will act as a summary for you to remember the various processes and forces that are involved. Okay, so this is a good diagram to copy down in your notebook and also to remember. Now we are going to discuss the diffusion of water from soil into the root of the plant, and then after that we are going to discuss how water diffuses into the xylem vessels in the root and then up the xylem vessels in the stem. How does water move in the xylem vessels of the stem? What forces are involved to pull it up or to push it up to the leaves? And then we are going to discuss the movement of water from xylem vessels into the leaf cells, and then finally about the process of transpiration, where water evaporates from the cells, some water evaporates from the cells and diffuse out as water vapor into the atmosphere through the stomata. Okay, so we are going to discuss the pathway of water from soil to root, from root to stem, and then from stem to leaves, and then finally into the atmosphere, right? So as a summary, water diffuses from soil into the root hair cells by osmosis. And then from one root hair cell to the next cell, the root cells, the other root cells in the cortex. So water diffuses through the root cells by osmosis. And then when water arrives at the xylem vessels, now how does water move into the xylem vessels? Firstly, there must be active transport of mineral ions, which needs energy, from the root cells into the xylem vessels. So after that, osmosis will occur, which does not need energy. Osmosis, where water diffuses into the xylem vessels of the root. Now, the processes of osmosis through the root cells and the active transport of mineral ions creates a force called root pressure, which pushes the water up the xylem vessels in the root and into the stem. Right? So root pressure is a pushing force caused by osmosis of water in the root and also active transport of mineral ions into the xylem vessels of the root. And then for the movement of water up the stem, three forces are involved. Transpirational pull, number one, transpirational pull, number two, capillary action, which is made up of the force of cohesion and adhesion, and then also root pressure from below. So these three forces cause water to move up the stem, and then when water arrives at the leaves, the water will diffuse from the xylem vessels into the leaf cells, and from each leaf cell to the next one by osmosis again. Now after that, some water evaporates from the leaf cells and diffuse out through the process of transpiration and diffuse out into the atmosphere. So this involves the process of transpiration, which is the evaporation of water from the leaf into the atmosphere. Now in chapter 3, we have studied about osmosis, and there's this osmosis rule that we can recall. The rule is that water always moves from an area of higher water potential, such as A, or an area of higher concentration of water. So all these blue molecules are water molecules, to an area of lower water potential, B, or lower concentration of water, through the semi-permeable membrane by osmosis. Alright, so water always moves in this direction, from a region of high concentration of water to a region of lower concentration of water, or from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential. Right, down the concentration gradient. So no energy is needed for this process. Alright, as water moves down the concentration gradient from a region of high water potential or high concentration of water in A to a region or area that has low water potential or low concentration of water. Now, we also have to keep in mind that an area with higher water potential or high concentration of water has what concentration of salts or solutes, higher or lower? Now, if the area has high water potential or high concentration of water, it will have lower concentration of salts or solutes, such as mineral ions, sucrose, and other substances that are dissolved in the water. Alright. Now, if the region has low water potential or low concentration of water, it means that it has higher concentration of the salts or the solutes. Right? So the concentration of water and the concentration of salts are just like, the opposite of each other. If you have higher concentration of water, you will have lower concentration of salts compared to another solution. Okay? So remember, water always moves from an area of higher water potential to an area of low water potential down the concentration gradient of water by osmosis and through a semi-permeable membrane, such as the plasma membrane of cells or the whisking tubing membrane. Let us first discuss the movement of water from soil into the root. Okay, so how does water move from the soil here? Now these are the soil particles. So how does water move from the soil into the root hair cells? Alright, root hair cells are cells that have long projections called the root hairs to increase the total surface area of the root for the absorption of water. Right? So in the root hair cells such as A actively pump mineral ions from soil solution into their cell sap in vacuoles. Right? So firstly, before osmosis of water occurs, the root hair cells here carry out active transport of mineral ions. Actively pump mineral ions means to carry out active transport of mineral ions into their cells and into their vacuoles. Alright? Into the cell sap in the vacuoles. So the mineral ions are, for example, magnesium ions, nitrate ions, phosphate ions, calcium ions. They are all in the soil. So although the root hair cells already have a high concentration of these mineral ions in the cell sap, they are still pumping these mineral ions from the soil into the cell sap. Okay, so this is to create a lower water potential in the vacuole, because as the cell sap gets more and more of these mineral ions from the soil, it will have higher mineral ion concentration but lower water potential than the soil. Now remember, the concentration of mineral ions and the concentration of water in the cell sap is just like the opposite of each other. If one is higher, if the mineral ion concentration is higher, then the concentration of water will be lower. Thus, there will be lower water potential in the cell sap. of the root hair cells, okay, due to its high mineral ion concentration. Thus, this creates a situation or condition where there is a concentration gradient of water. The soil will have higher concentration of water and higher water potential than the cell set of root hair cells. Okay, thus water will diffuse according to the osmosis rule. Water diffuses from the soil into the root hair cells by osmosis, which does not require energy. Okay, so active transport of mineral ions occur first, and this requires energy. Active transport of mineral ions by root hair cells occur first, and this requires energy. But after that, water diffuses into the root hair cells by osmosis, and this does not require energy. Now next, after water has diffused into the root hair cells in the epidermal layer, how does water move from one cell to the next in the roots? So once water enters the root hair cell, the water potential in the root hair cells will become higher than that of the adjacent cortex cells. Okay, the concentration of water in root hair cells will increase, and its water potential will increase and be more than the adjacent cortex cell, cell B. Adjacent means the neighboring cell or the cell beside the first cell, A. So now there is a concentration gradient of water, and water will diffuse from cell A, which has higher water potential, into cell B, which has lower water potential, by osmosis. Okay, so water diffuses from root hair cells into adjacent cortex cells by osmosis, and then this will make cell B have higher water potential, cause cell B to have higher water potential as it's received water from cell A. It will have higher water potential than cell C. Thus, osmosis will occur again, where water diffuses from cell B to cell C. So in this way, osmosis occurs continuously in the cells of the cortex, endodermis, pericycle, and into the xylem vessels. All right. So the movement of water through the root here is all by osmosis until it reaches the xylem vessel. And it is like a domino effect. When water enters one cell, it will cause it to have high water potential than the neighboring cell. So water will diffuse into the next cell and into the next cell and so forth. Okay, this is called something like a domino effect. Now, so this process of water movement by osmosis creates a pushing force called root pressure. So root pressure is a force, not a process. And root pressure is a force that moves water from soil into the root cells and then into xylem vessels of the root through the process of osmosis. So osmosis is the process that produces the force called root pressure, which is a pushing force that pushes water into the xylem vessels in the roots. And when water goes into the xylem vessels in the roots, it will move up the stem. It will be pushed up the stem. Pushed up the xylem vessels in the stem. Here's an extra point that is not mentioned in the textbook, right? So we know that water moves by osmosis. Water diffuses by osmosis from one root cell to the next and into the xylem vessel, right? Water always diffuses by osmosis through the cells, and this does not require energy. But in the area of the endodermis, root cells also carry out active transport of mineral ions, right, into the xylem vessels D, shown here. So similarly, as we have seen before, in the root hair cells, they carry out active transport of mineral ions from soil into their cell set. So remember, for mineral ions, they are actively transported into the root cells. So when root cells actively transport the mineral ions into the xylem vessels here. It will make the xylem vessels more concentrated with the ions or solutes. And when there's a higher concentration of solutes or dissolved substances or ions in the xylem vessels will have lower water potential than the root cells surrounding it. So again, there is a concentration gradient or a difference in concentration between the root cells and xylem vessels. So water will diffuse into the xylem vessels by osmosis from a region of higher water potential in the root cells here into the xylem vessels which have lower water potential. Okay, and overall, osmosis and the active transport of mineral ions creates the root pressure, which is a pushing force that pushes water from the root into the xylem vessels of roots and up the stem. Here's an experiment to demonstrate root pressure in plants. So first, find a healthy balsam plant, plant it in the pot, and then water the soil, water the plant, and make sure the soil is wet and keep it overnight. This is to ensure that the plant has enough water. The next morning, cut the stem of the balsam plant. All right, so cut it about 5 cm from the soil surface here, 5 cm. So after that, using a rubber tubing or tube, connect the end of the cut stem to a glass tube here. Now make sure the connection here is airtight by applying some petroleum jelly to the connections, because if it's not airtight, we will not be able to get the results. Now mark the initial water level in the glass tube here with a marker pen, right? Then leave this apparatus for 30 minutes or more, and after that observe the final water level. Okay, so we find that the final water level is higher than the initial water level. All right, another thing that can be done is to add a layer of oil on top here to make sure that this water does not evaporate into the air. All right, so you want to find out where this extra volume of water came from. Okay, the answer is that it came from the soil. The water diffused into the roots by osmosis, and then it moved into the xylem vessels of the roots due to the root pressure, which is a force in the roots that pushes water from root into the xylem vessels of roots and then up the stem. Okay, still in the xylem vessels. So when we cut the stem here, water will exude out or will move out, and then it will cause the final water level to go up after some time. All right, so the movement of water is from the soil into the root hairs and the root cells, into the root cells, and then due to root pressure, which is a force in the roots that pushes the water into the xylem vessels of roots here in the center, and then up the stem. Okay, so the water comes out from the xylem vessels of the stem and causes the final water level to increase after some time. So this proves that there is a force acting below here at the root called the root pressure, which has forced water up the stem and into the glass tube here. Now here we have an animation of the movement of water molecules represented by the blue dots here from the soil into the root cells and up the xylem vessels of the root and the stem. Okay, so the water molecule moves from the soil into the root hair cells and then through the root cells and then up the xylem vessels. Right? So the movement of water from the soil into the root hair cells and through the root and into the xylem vessel all occurs by osmosis, right? And it creates the root pressure force. And there's also the active transport of mineral salts or mineral ions into the xylem vessels that occurs from the root cells into the xylem vessels, where the mineral ions are actively pumped into the xylem vessels with the use of energy. So we have already discussed the movement of water in the roots and the formation of the force called root pressure, which can push water into the xylem vessels and up the stem. However, root pressure is not enough to help water move up from the roots to the stems and leaves for very tall plants. For example, the California redwood tree can reach a height of more than 100 meters, and it does not need a pump to pump water from the roots to the stems and to the leaves, high up there at the top. So how does the plant or the tree do it? So there are two other forces involved in the transport of water up the xylem vessels. First one is capillary action, which occurs in the xylem vessels, and the second one is transpirational pull, okay, which we will talk about later. Now, so let's talk about capillary action. Capillary action occurs in the xylem vessels of the stem, and it is a force that causes water to move up the xylem vessels in the stem against gravity. So one way of showing capillary action is to fill a glass with water and put a straw inside. You'll see that the water can climb up, climb up the straw up to a certain level, higher than the level of water in the glass, right? This shows the capillary action of water. So we have studied about the properties of water in Form 4, and we know that capillary action actually consists of two forces, right? The force of cohesion, which is the force of attraction between like molecules. For example, the force of attraction between two water molecules. So water molecules are polar molecules with uneven distribution of charges. A water molecule has a negatively charged end, which is the oxygen end, and positively charged ends, which are the hydrogen ends, right? So although it overall is a neutral molecule, it has uneven distribution of charges. Therefore, the negative end of one water molecule can attract the positive end of another water molecule. For example, here we see the hydrogen atom of one water molecule attracted to the oxygen atom of another water molecule. Okay, so this produces the force of attraction. Okay, because we say that water is a polar molecule with an even distribution of charges, right? And so this helps water molecules to stick to each other, to be attached to each other. And when one water molecule is pulled up, the rest will also follow. They will not, this whole chain will not break. So water will move out as a continuous water column, like a string of beads that are pulled upwards, right? There's a string of beads that are connected to each other, right? So the force of cohesion helps water to move as a continuous water column in xylem vessels. And then there's another force, which is the force of attraction between different types of molecules. For example, between the water molecule and the wall of the xylem vessel. Okay, so the molecules here are different, but there is a force of adhesion between them. So cohesion and adhesion produces the capillary action in the xylem vessels, capillary action. So this can help to in the movement of water up the stem. So here we see the force of cohesion, and here the force of adhesion. Lastly, let's look at the formation of a third force, the discussion of how a third force, transpirational pull, is formed. So in the leaves, transpiration occurs in the daytime where water molecules evaporate from spongy mesophyll cells into the air spaces and diffuse out through the stoma or stomata into the atmosphere. So in the daytime, the gut cells will open the stoma or stomata, plural form stomata, and water molecules evaporate from mesophyll cells, from the surface of mesophyll cells into the air spaces in the leaf, and after that they diffuse out through the stoma into the atmosphere. This is the process of transpiration. So when transpiration occurs, the spongy mesophyll cells like A have lost water. So its cell sap will have lower water potential or lower concentration of water compared to the adjacent cell B, which may have lost less water or no water, right? So there is a concentration gradient of water now occurring. And water will diffuse from region of higher water potential, which is from cell B, into region of lower water potential, which is in cell A, by osmosis. Then cell B, having lost water, will have lower water potential than cell C. So water will then diffuse from cell C into cell B by osmosis. Again, we see the domino effect, right? Where when water is lost from one cell, it will draw water from another cell by osmosis. So this process of osmosis is repeated with other cells until finally water is drawn from xylem vessels in the veins of the leaves by osmosis into the leaf cells, and to replace the water that is lost by the cells and the water that's lost through transpiration. So because of transpiration, a pulling force is produced, and also because of osmosis, two processes, transpiration and also osmosis of water from one cell to the next, produces a force called transpirational pull, right? So transpirational pull is a suction force that pulls water up the xylem vessels from roots to the stem and then to the leaves. And then after that, the water will diffuse from cell to cell by osmosis, and some of it will be lost through transpiration. Now, if there's no transpiration, there's no formation of the force called transpirational pull. But on a bright day, warm day, the transpirational pull force is very strong, and it is a pulling force that can pull the water up, move the water up the plant from roots to stem and leaves. So to summarize and to also practice, put to practice what we have learned, let's look at this common essay question. It's like a HOTS question too, that may be asked in your exam. Essay question. The diagram shows a tree transporting water up its stem during a sunny day. So you can see the arrows showing the flow or the movement of water up the stem to the leaves. Explain the pathway of water from the roots to the leaves. Okay, so we have to underline here transporting water. We'll talk about the transport of water up the stem. Okay, on a sunny day, so sunny day, there will be transpiration occurring where there is loss of water or evaporation of water from the plant to the atmosphere. And then we have to explain the pathway of water in the roots and also in the leaves. All right, so roots, stems, and leaves. So here's the answer, which is similar to the notes that we have discussed just now. The pathway for the movement of water is from soil to roots and then to the stem and leaves. Firstly, in the roots. In the roots, root hair cells actively pump mineral ions from the soil solution into their cell sap in the vacuoles. This causes cell sap of root hair cells to have higher ion concentration but lower water potential compared to the soil. Thus, water will diffuse from the soil, which has higher water potential, into the root hair cells, which have lower water potential, by osmosis. Now, this makes the water potential in the root hair cells become higher than that of the adjacent cortex cells. So water diffuses from root hair cells into the adjacent cortex cells by osmosis. And so osmosis occurs continuously between the cells of the cortex, endodermis, and pericycle layers. This produces a force called root pressure that pushes water into the xylem vessels of the root and then up the stem. Now, in the second part of the answer, we are going to discuss the movement of water in xylem vessels of the stem. So this movement of water in xylem vessels of the stem is helped by three forces: root pressure, capillary action of xylem, and transpirational pull. So in the stem, the capillary action of xylem, which is a pulling force, causes water to move up the xylem vessels. Now, capillary action consists of two forces, cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion is the force of attraction between like molecules, and this helps water molecules to stick together to each other and form a continuous water column in the xylem vessels. Force of adhesion is the force of attraction between different types of molecules, for example, between water molecules and the xylem wall. And lastly, in the leaves, the process of transpiration occurs during the day. Water evaporates from spongy mesophyll cells and diffuses out of the leaves into the surroundings through the opened stomata. The spongy mesophyll cells thus lose water, and they will have lower water potential than adjacent cells. So water molecules diffuse from the adjacent cells into the first spongy mesophyll cells by osmosis. And this process is repeated with the other cells, and eventually water is drawn from the xylem vessels in the veins of the leaves by osmosis. All right? Water diffuses from xylem vessels into the mesophyll cells by osmosis. So this movement of water produces a force called transpirational pull, which is a suction force that pulls water molecules from roots to xylem vessels in stem and to leaves. So this is the complete answer, which is of course a bit long, and as long as the points are there. So maybe the teacher will have more than 10 points, but as long as you have any 10 points, you get the marks. All right? So remember to put in the keywords like the three forces: root pressure, capillary action, force of cohesion, force of adhesion, transpirational pull, transpiration. All these are the keywords. Here's a good memory aid to help you remember the three forces that help in the movement of water from roots to leaves. Ron pressures Captain Ace to transfer Paul. Ron or Ro or Ronaldo. Think of football. So Ron pressure stands for root pressure. Captain Ace, cap and ace, so capillary action. Transfer Paul represents transpirational pull. Okay, Ron pressures Captain Ace to transfer Paul. All right, for all the football fans, easy to remember. So maybe Ron's a player pressuring his captain, called Captain Ace, to transfer Paul to another team. Now, you can write this sentence plus the meaning and the three forces. Write it all down on a piece of paper like this, okay? And then stick it on a wall in your room. So with constant reviewing of the memory aid, you should be able to remember it after a while, okay? So it's useful for exams. All right, so that's all for this lesson. I hope you have benefited from all the explanations given and from the memory aid and also from the question that was discussed. Please do share, like, and subscribe. Till then, goodbye and see you in the next video.